format pursuant to the Standing Order House of Commons on November 25th of 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Per the directive of the Board of Internal Economy on March 10th of 2022, all those attending the meeting in person must wear a mask, except for members who are at their place during proceedings. I would like to make a few comments for the benefits of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Just for the witnesses, we do have a couple items that we have to take care of for committee business. So if you don't mind, we'll just go through the procedural beginnings. We need to adopt our budget for the study, and you've received from the clerk the preliminary budget for the study of resource development and violence against Indigenous women and girls in the amount of $14,345. So if everybody's had the opportunity to look at that, those are things like the microphone sets that we have that and any additional expenses. So is there a will of the committee to adopt the preliminary budget? All those in favor, if you can just raise your hand. Fantastic. And in the room, fantastic. I see that's all good to go, clerk, and that's adopted. Moving on to this very important study, the briefs in Indigenous languages. The clerk and the analyst have looked into the possibility of receiving briefs written in Indigenous languages for its study of resource development and violence against Indigenous women and girls. If it is the will of the committee, I would like to propose that the committee accept briefs written in these following languages. And please correct me because I do make errors on this. Inuktitut, Algonquin, Densulin, Chippewan, Cree Mischief, and Blackfoot. So please, if someone could properly say that, let's get those properly said into the record for that. It was advised that we would be able to take 4 Indigenous languages. That is what basically based on what's available through interpretive and translation services, that they would be able to take up to 4 just with the large variety that are available. Is it of the will of the committee that we have agreement that we'll accept documents based on that? Can I see all those in favor? If you can raise your hand. Fantastic. Thank you, Ms. Clerk. That looks like it's passed as well. I now want to welcome our witnesses. For today, we're going to be changing it up, our format a bit. So to our witnesses, this is our first dry run of this and we're doing it live. So we'll be working through this together. But I would like to welcome Diane Redsky, who is the Executive Director with Maui Wichi Ituata Center Incorporated. From Deborah Grigg, clinical social worker, mental health services provider with the Yukon Aboriginal Women's Council. And we have Nina Kang, Executive Director for Ending Violence Association of British Columbia, and Leslie Varley, Executive Director of British Columbia Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centers. And they are part of the Ending Violence Association of British Columbia and British Columbia Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centers. So I'd like to thank all of the witnesses here today. Each of you will be provided 5 minutes. I have my nice little card here that says 1 minute remaining. With our new format, we will be able to be maybe a little bit more flexible, up to maybe 15 to 20 seconds, but we want to make sure we have as many opportunities for questions. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass the floor over to Diane. Diane, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm just noting the time, so because I won't be able to see that nice picture you have there once I start. Okay, so Buju Shueganu Nadishnakaz at Dikdodam. My spirit name is Love Eagle, and I'm from the Caribou clan. My English name is Diane Redsky. I acknowledge the traditional territory and Shoal Lake First Nation for the water that is provided from my community to the city of Winnipeg. I also acknowledge the ancestors of Treaty 3 and acknowledge your ancestors who I believe walk with you each and every day. So today we're here to focus on the MMIW calls for justice 3.4 and 13.5, 13.4 and 13.5 of the National Inquiry, with recommendations to address the relationship between resource development and violence against Indigenous women and girls. I would firstly like to acknowledge the MMIW 2S Plus families and survivors here today, and for the families that continue to seek justice. It is your voice and the voice of generations of families and survivors who never gave up to be heard, respected, treated equitably, and to be secure and safe. Your strong and powerful voice made the National Inquiry in Canada happen. Thank you, Miigwech, from all of us. I would like to thank also the MMIW 2S Plus National Inquiry and acknowledge and honor the voices of our families, survivors, and stakeholders in the 231 calls for justice. I presented at the National Inquiry on sexual exploitation and sex trafficking of Indigenous women and girls in Canada, and I chair the Urban Working Group for the MMIW National Action Plan. What is also relevant to today is my work as the project director for the 2011-2015 National Task Force on Sex Trafficking of Women and Girls in Canada, and of course my role as the executive director for the Mum-Wichita Center. This is a very important issue, and thank you for looking into this relationship between resource development and violence against women and girls in Canada. Firstly, there are a couple of reports that I feel are really important for you to look at. The MMIW 2S Plus National Action Plans. There are a number of those national action plans, and these reports get into implementation of the recommendations, and they really need to have a voice and place in this process. The urban report, of course, specifically talks about co-development, which I'll get into in a minute. The Manitoba Clean Environment Commission, that is a report. It was a study that was done of the social impacts of hydro development in northern Manitoba. And I would strongly encourage this committee to reach out to MKO, which is the Northern Political Organization led by Grand Chief Settee. That is a very important part of this process as well. My experience working in the sector for over 20 years, and specifically regarding resource development, also known as man camps, are breeding grounds for predators to have full access to victimize Indigenous women and girls, not to mention the unique vulnerabilities of our relatives who are Two-Spirit LGBTQIA. There is also a clear connection between sexual exploited women and these man camps, who are notorious for normalizing prostitution, buying and selling of sex at all social, physical, and financial costs. This is sexual exploitation and violence against women and girls. My experience is anytime there are men with money who are transient, you're going to have sexual exploitation of women and girls and some form of violence against Indigenous women and girls. There is a very scary sense of entitlement that men from these man camps have, which is further perpetuated by society's harmful stereotypes that Indigenous women will do anything for money, and you can do anything to an Indigenous woman and no one will do anything about it. Men get away with victimizing Indigenous women all the time. An example, a very quick example is, and I won't mention the city or the organization because I don't have their permission, but what is important is their experience is being very common. This organization is located in a city with significant resource development. Their local organization dedicated to empowering girls regularly, and I emphasize regularly, has men coming into their organization asking if there are young girls for sale. Resource development is harmful to our women and girls and is 100% preventable. And I'm just going to conclude with 6 recommendations. Firstly, when looking at the MMIW calls for justice 13.4 and 13.5, you have to look at these along with the 4th pathways and the principles for change as outlined in the National Inquiry. Failing to do this results in missing that whole big picture and that transformational change that is necessary in order to solve this genocide of violence against Indigenous women in this country. And I would also add the UNDRIP and TRC. The second one is I understand that there's a vital balancing act between industry, government, and communities. And I strongly believe there needs to be mandating of corporate social responsibility by industry to understand and plan for the impact their actions will have to the land and to the local communities.
20 more seconds.
You bet.
About 20. Okay.
Okay. And then, of course, the MKO, the work that is done by the Northern First Nations in Manitoba. The fourth one is the Urban Sub-Working Group report. And the fifth one is the Grand Council Treaty 3 has a great earth law. And these are traditional laws that are made for and by Indigenous people within their territory, and those need to be valued and respected. So their short-term job should not leave a legacy of victimization.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Diane. I'm now going to move the floor over to Yukon Aboriginal Women's Council, Deborah Gregg. Deborah, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much for our participation. I'm here on behalf of Terry Zabo. I'm a clinical social worker and a mental health service provider. I've been working with First Nations people in rural communities for more than 43 years. I am just trying to put all this together. I had short notice and I'll do the best I can here. Yukon Aboriginal Women's Council needs the committee to know that colonization has played a great role in the disempowerment of the First Nations people all across Canada. And resource development has fed into the continuing process of colonization. We have seen that industry has pillaged the land and that the people have not authentically been involved in an empowering way, and they tend to have the low-paying jobs, and they tend to not stay in the industry because they have not the continued opportunities for development to take on more powerful positions. Industry needs to be educated regarding the plight of the First Nations people and the results of colonization all across Canada, particularly in the north, which has so much disempowered the people of the First Nations communities. We need to have the committee consider who plays a role in the educational transformation of the resource developers. They need to be enlightened as to the damage that has been done. They need to see that the First Nations people have been disempowered. There needs to be resources put in place so that the First Nations people can take on equivalent opportunities for development in education and in the planning of resources. Gender-based violence has been an outcome of resource development all over the north, and I'm sure all over Canada. So industry needs to be educated to the extent of the oppression of the people, and things need to be put in place to mitigate the damage that has been done. Government needs to consider who plays a role in the educational transformation of resource development. There needs to be security for the women who work in and near the resource development sites. This would include such things as on-site Indigenous security, as well as available 1-800 numbers so that the female workers can call with the confidence that they're not going to lose their job for reporting on situations that they see that are violence towards them, such as derogatory comments, such as racial comments, such as sexual misogyny, which goes on in the camps. This needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed right from the get-go so that the security of the women can be put in place. Yukon Aboriginal Women's Council also asks you to consider who provides the funding for the engagement of the economic development for the First Nations people and the resource development. The IBA agreements must be implemented so that they work for the benefit of the empowerment of First Nations people. We can see that if you think about the way personalities develop and you think about the way societies develop, everything starts from the self. And if you look at colonization as a form of aggression, you can see that they are the bullies and that the First Nations people all across the land were the victims. So that relationship has always stayed the same. Government, resource development have bullied the First Nations people everywhere, and the First Nations people have become more and more passive and more disempowered as time goes on. And they're in a state of apathy, and that needs to be shifted. And that can only be shifted if there are enough resources and enough opportunities for positive change and positive empowerment of the people all across the land so that they can be equal partners in all of this and not just the recipients of what gets done to them. They need to, instead of just having the pick and shovel jobs, they need to have the jobs all up the line so that they can be in control of what is happening in their communities and what is happening for the resources in all the areas where resource development wants to take things. such as colonization has always done, colonization has always taken. We want a more level playing field, and we want supports put in place so that the opportunities are more equal for all of the First Nations people so that they can rise to the challenges and become more empowered. I'm sure you're all familiar with Abraham Maslow and his theory of self-actualization. I'm not sure if you're aware that he actually studied the Blackfoot people in Alberta when he came to that conclusion. And the Blackfoot people in Alberta at that time were a very empowered people. And we want to see the people empowered again. And so all the steps of self-actualization have to be put in place, which will allow for the people to be on a more level playing field with everybody else in resource development.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. You obviously saw my little purple pen going, so thank you so much. I'm now going to move it over for the next 5 minutes, and this is shared time between Nuna Kang and Leslie Varley, both from British Columbia. So Nina, I'm going to let you guys decide how to work this out, and I'll pass the floor to you for the next 5 minutes.
I'm going to yield to Leslie to start, and then I will pick up the last minute of our 5 minutes.
Hi, everybody. I'm Leslie Varley. I'm the Executive Director at BC Association of Friendship Centres. I belong to the Giskask clan of the Niska Nation and reside at Musqueam Territory in Vancouver. And I'm calling in today from beautiful Lekwungen Territory in Victoria. I'm just going to jump right into some recommendations. There's so many issues that need to happen, and they need to happen collectively and collaboratively. First of all, we Indigenous women know that our women and girls are known and accepted collateral damage by both government and by the resource sector in the sense that this stuff happens and we pay. Yet we still don't hold the sector accountable nor government accountable for their workers. So my recommendations are mostly around funding Indigenous organizations to provide services to our own people, but I have a few more. And the first is that we need to require resource industries to work with local nations and urban Indigenous women to develop credible and practical safety plans for Indigenous women and girls. And those plans also need to include the accountability of the resource sector themselves and accountability for their workers. In a recent situation in northern BC, a resource industry company presented a so-called safety reconciliation plan to the town council. They proposed a safety plan for Indigenous women and girls. This plan was for all men to wear a little awareness campaign item on their clothing. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. And these awareness campaigns are never evaluated for effectiveness. Their leaders are not vetted thoroughly from a women's safety perspective. And industry and government seem to love these visual but ineffective responses where they're essentially seen to be doing something. These actions are meaningless to Indigenous women. Any racist can wear that little pledge button. It really isn't helping. These man-made solutions help the entrepreneur make a profit off the violence that we Indigenous women experience. In this instance, Indigenous women were never consulted by that resource company in developing safety plans for Indigenous women, and this is a very common experience for us. And that one was fresh. That was this week. I also think it's really important for us to support realistic and practical funding for Indigenous people, meeting them where they live. In BC, 85% of us live off reserve, and we still have no long-term funding for violence against women and the wraparound services needed to support us. We still have to go through our mainstream colleagues to get funding. We at BC Association of Friendship Centres with 25 centres are only project-based to develop capacity. I remind us it's 2022, and we are still project-based in anti-violence funding. And there's a shortage of Indigenous wraparound services. Indigenous organizations are grossly underfunded compared to mainstream organizations. There are too few culturally appropriate services for Indigenous people, and therefore we have fewer ways to interface with professionals who can help us, who can provide us with support or connect us to support services. All these areas need to be supported comprehensively so that we can properly service our own communities. Another area is the police. The police are We need to work with the police to make them investigate. They have it within their discretion to decide whether they will investigate or not. So police are in fact gatekeeping much of these issues. We need to hold them accountable for collecting data. And the police input the data that goes to Stats Canada, and yet Stats Canada clearly indicates to us that there is a severe dearth of data. I think finally, I'm just going to talk about housing. The housing situation for women fleeing violence is horrific. A home where a woman can raise her children in is a luxury most of us cannot afford in this province. We need to fund Indigenous urban groups and First Nations to develop more second stage housing. There's often nowhere to go, and men exploiting women know that there is no security or without the safety of housing. So housing is what we need to keep women and their children grounded and safe so that they have less need to go into the survival sex trade, so that they have to put up with violent relationships and endure violence against their bodies, and so that they can better protect their daughters and sons from sexual exploitation. Thank you. Over to you, Nino.
Thank you, Leslie. Hello, I'm Ninu Kang, the Executive Director of Ending Violence Association of BC. I'm calling from the unceded ancestral territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. I'm honored today to present with Leslie Varley, who you've heard from. Here at EVA BC, we recognize when I was invited to join this panel, it was important that in the local context that Leslie and I, who are working as executive directors in our local areas, that I call on her and I ask her to lead this discussion. At Ending Violence Association of BC, we recognize that as an organization, we are part of the structures of colonial systems. And as Leslie has spoken, many times we talk on the back and ourselves about for Indigenous women, and really to be looking at any issue related to Indigenous women, it's not only the violence.
About 10 more seconds.
It's not only about Indigenous women, but it's about their families and communities. So today I'm here as an ally. I'm going to yield back and be happy to answer any questions in partnership with Leslie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to our panelists. So as I said, today we're doing it live, but we are changing it up a bit. So I just want to let the membership of our colleagues know how the questioning will go. So for the first round, each party will have 6 minutes. For the second round, 5 minutes to the CPC and Liberals, and 2.5 minutes to the Bloc and NDP. Then we go on to third round, where each party once again is going to be given 6 minutes. For the fourth round, it goes back to the CPCs and the Conservatives for 5 minutes, and then 2.5 minutes to the CPC or to the Bloc and NDP, and then back to the CPC and Liberals for 5 minutes. So we've worked out those times so that everybody can get their broad share, but everybody should have similar amounts at the very, very beginning where we're asking many of the questions. So we're going to start this. I will be pretty close on time since we are changing this up. I won't let you go way over time. I'm going to be watching the clock on this one a little tighter, but we'll turn the first 6 minutes over to Michelle. Michelle Ferry, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you so much to the witnesses for joining us today. Very honored to have you here. I'm asking a quick yes or no question before I go into questioning, just so we're on the same page. If everyone can give me a yes or no, would you consider building pipelines, resource development? Is that something that you would consider in that realm? That's for everyone.
Yes.
If you could answer on the record, so we do have it yeses or nos. I see that we have lots of nods and things, but if we could just actually answer so that they could get on the record.
Yes.
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 So I have 4 yeses. Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm also wondering if I could, I guess I'll start with Diane. Diane, do you have any stats on the reduction in family violence with economic development in the community? And if you don't, we can table them for committee.
Right. I do not have stats.
Okay. Does Deborah, Leslie, or Ninu have any of those stats?
No, I don't.
No. Okay.
No, I don't.
So it's a no from everyone.
No.
Okay, thank
No,
you. If there was
thank
any
you.
opportunity, I guess I really like some of the recommendations that are coming from all of you in terms of mandating corporate social responsibility. I had the privilege this past week to visit Alberta and Jasper and Banff, and I had the privilege to speak with a chief, female chief of the SIP First Nation, and very pro-pipeline and how much it's injected into their community of jobs and opportunity. And I guess I'm asking, how do we find that balance of bringing economic growth and decreasing poverty with a decrease in violence? And I guess I would ask for your key recommendations, and I'll ask Diane in particular, what does that mandating corporate social responsibility look like for you?
Well, I'd like to first of all say that all the answers and the solutions are always at the community, at the grassroots level. And we strongly, as doing all this work on violence against women, a co-development approach is critical. So you have government and industry and community sitting at a common table to co-develop and co-create what the solutions are to really get ahead of and being proactive. And so, you know, and then the recommendations, and I will be very quick on what we'd like to see in terms of some industry standards around corporate social responsibility. So mandatory training on violence against women, sexual exploitation. They should have to contribute to a fund that is managed by an Indigenous-led organization to address the harms to the social impact. Mandatory child abuse and criminal record checks so that there's some management of violent offenders coming into neighborhoods, and a monitoring body, hefty fines for non-compliance. And look at strategies that have worked across the country. And I'm only aware of one initiative in Quebec that had some promising results.
And that the economic injection that happens is beneficial as well to these communities.
Absolutely. And everybody needs to be at the table planning for that in a meaningful way. And again, getting back to co-development and co-management.
For that. Deborah, if I could ask, I'm looking at our Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and under Business and Reconciliation 92.2, it says, ensure that Aboriginal peoples have equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities in the corporate sector, and that Aboriginal communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from economic development projects. Do you feel that the government, Deborah, is delivering on this mandate?
In my opinion, they're starting at the wrong place. They're offering all sorts of technical skills development, but they haven't addressed the emotional trauma that still permeates everywhere from colonization. If you're coming from a place of low power, you can have all the applications of credentials that you want, but you're still not whole from the inside out. And that is what needs to be addressed. I could tell you in the North, there's a tremendous amount of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and there's a tremendous amount of apathy, and there's a tremendous amount of dysfunction, and all of that is not addressed. You can keep applying the college diplomas and the certificates, but if you don't address the root issues of security and self-worth and personal empowerment, nothing's going to hold, because it falls through like sand. Because the core of the beings, the core of the people has to be healed.
Thank you.
That's where the attention needs to be.
You've got about 10 seconds.
Thank you, Deborah. I think I have another round of questioning, so I'll come back to that and pass it over to my colleague.
Thanks so much. We're now going to turn it over to Emanuela Lambropoulos. Emanuela, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to begin by thanking all of the witnesses for your great testimony and for being with us here to answer some of our questions on this very important issue. My first question is going to go to Ms. Varley. You mentioned that one of the first recommendations actually that you raised was the fact that safety plans need to be put in place for women and girls by these industries. And I was wondering if you can maybe give us a little bit more and expand a little bit more on that, on what specifically should be taken into account. I know that you also said that Indigenous women should be consulted in coming up with these plans. Absolutely. But if you can also give us a couple of pointers as to what direction that should go into if this was to be mandated.
Sure. Well, in the same way that Deborah Red Sky has addressed this as well, you need to be working with local First Nations and Indigenous urban communities to, when the resource sector is coming into town, to start developing those safety plans. And the same thing, really in-depth criminal records, setting some no tolerance rules for violence that are, within an employee's contract, so that if we know that there doesn't have to be a proof of violence at the end of the day through the criminal justice system, because Indigenous women don't go through the justice system for the most part. It's not safe for us. So we really need to work closely with the sector to develop some really strong safety plans. And, I think that the trouble for me in this process is that the safety plans become the onus of Indigenous women and organizations to create safety plans for ourselves. We really need to balance that with creating strong safety plans through the resource sector themselves. And government needs to work with us to hold that resource sector accountable for these safety plans. Because if Indigenous women are not going to the police and reporting violent crimes, and there's plenty of stats to say that we do, then we need to find other ways to address this. And that is putting some really strong policy, human resource policy around safety for local women for those workers who are working in those work camps.
Thank you very much. My next question is going to go to Ms. Deborah Gregg, who you've mentioned that you worked over 40 years as a therapist and helping Indigenous people in the North. And so I was wondering if you can tell us whether there have been programs to address the mental health issues, and just in general, if there's been funding towards mental health, because I am not aware of specific funding in Indigenous communities. If you can tell us about that first, and then I'll go on to my next question.
There has always been funding, but it's always short-term funding. Nothing's perpetual, and the problems are perpetual. So the agencies that get the funding are always in a state of anxiety as to whether or not they're going to get the funding again. All that has to be changed. The damage is deeply rooted in generations of people who have lost their power and can't give power to their children and can't motivate themselves to empower themselves. There's tremendous amount of damage that has been done, and the tremendous amount of damage needs to be addressed. Otherwise, you can put all the blanket things on top of everything, and the root is still going to be there. You have to heal the people. You have to heal the spirit of the people, and that funding must be perpetual, and it must be enough that it can actually be done professionally, instead of by people who come in with the best of intentions, but they may not have the best of skills. And so things just stay the same. We want to mitigate damage, and we want to see positive change. And in order to do that, you have to have assessments, you have to have resources, and you have to have people who can apply the resources in order to heal the people. And that's huge. That's absolutely huge. And the government has been hugely in deficit for that for 500 years.
I hear you. My next question to you, I guess, was more related to resource development. You mentioned that a lot of the reason behind a lot of the gender-based violence is colonization and resource development, and the fact that the bullies and the colonizers it's a cycle of violence that continues because of this power relationship. and I understand that most of that, a lot of that impacts mental health. But if you can maybe talk a little bit about what you think would help change that. Well, let's pretend that we were able to completely address mental health. What would be the next step in order to help empower Indigenous women in these communities and just Indigenous peoples in these communities in terms of the job availability up there and in these projects once they're available?
Well, if you could fix all the mental health problems first, that would be fine. And then you need to have educational opportunities because people have to take the steps to empower themselves, to be self-actualized. So the root problems have to be solved. All the addictions have to be solved. All the resources need to be applied so that there are treatments for the addictions. And then there needs to be funding for perpetual education, accessible education. Some of the remote areas don't even have colleges accessible, and they would have to go on Zoom, and the people don't even have computers, so they can't even go on Zoom. It's outrageous, some of the deprivation in some of the rural areas, and the people are in states of apathy. They feel like they're not going to get there, so they do nothing, and that's really, really sad. So education would need to be second after the first fixing of all the mental health problems, and then opportunities for economic development would have to be there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're now going to move it over for 6 minutes to Adrienne LaRoche. Adrienne, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. I would like to start with Ms. Barley, or rather with Ms. Red Sky, because you talked about the United Nations Declaration and the importance that Canada recognize that declaration for Indigenous people. And it opens the way to a better protection of women and a better dialogue with Indigenous people. Can you tell us more, Ms. Red Sky, on that, please?
Yes, thanks for that. And I really want the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People is a really important human rights instrument to recognize the inherent rights of Indigenous people. And so, and this goes also to what I was speaking in my opening, was around, we have our own laws, and we have our own solutions to very complex issues. The challenge and the reality for many of the communities is that those answers aren't ever listened to, supported, funded, properly evaluated, so that there can be a business case. They're often ignored, and then nothing gets done. And then we end up always in this perpetual cycle of, we have all the answers, but yet we don't get the resources in order to implement those solutions in order to make significant change. And so the will and the spirit and the vibrancy and the inherent values of our culture is strong, always has been. We're here for a reason. And so I really think that's important. UNDRIP is an important recognition of that strength of Indigenous people in Canada, and needs to be supported at all aspects. And again, I want to refer to how you get there is really that co-development approach, and by engaging with industry, government, and communities, all sitting at the same table. So that to me is the answer and the opportunity.
Donc, si je comprends bien.
So, Ms. Red Sky, not having signed it when it's been requested contributed to violence perpetrated by certain companies against women. So not signing that had an impact. To refuse to sign for a long time.
Je vois votre chemin.
I can see you nodding. So I imagine you agree.
Way that our nationhood is not validated.
Is there quite a bit of feedback?
Oui. Est-ce que je peux continuer, Madame?
Can I continue, Madam Chair?
Did you get the answer to the question from Ms. Red
J'ai eu la
Sky?
difficulté à entendre.
I was having a hard time understanding.
Did she get the Adrian? Did she get the answer from Ms. Red Sky, or would you like to re-ask that question? I have stopped the clock for you.
Oui, c'est vrai qu'il y a eu beaucoup.
There was a lot of feedback. So, Ms. Red Sky, you were nodding your head and then you added something about not signing or refusing to sign the United Nations Declaration for a long time contributed most likely to the situation of companies that were exploiting Indigenous people. So if you wouldn't mind repeating what you said after nodding, that would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you. So I said yes, and this is another example of not signing on to the UNDRIP is not valuing the strengths and the inherent rights of Indigenous people in Canada. And so that has implications that bring us here today and what we're talking about.
Parfait. J'aurais une prochaine.
Thank you. I have another question. It's a more general question, and all of the witnesses will be able to answer. We talked a lot about the importance for some communities. There's economic development to take into account and security, safety, reducing violence. But I would also like to come back to the fact that we need to find a balance between economic development and protection of women, but also protection of the environment, because it can have an impact on the environment, and protecting the environment is very important for Indigenous people with Mother Earth. It is essential. So if you could talk about that balance, so economic development, protecting the environment, and protecting women.
If it's okay, I'd like to. Is that okay? Okay. It's really important to acknowledge those natural laws that are inherent in the lives in the community in our First Nation communities. And just to make reference to one, and this is one of many that I hope that this committee explores, but Grand Council Treaty 3 has a Great Earth Law. And reading that Great Earth Law will really help you understand how everything is interconnected. So looking at valuing the connection to the land, to the water, to the sky, but also to the implication to what happens to people. And so we really have to look at this as holistic. And Indigenous people and the First Peoples have been on that, from time immemorial. With our natural laws. So they do exist and would be helpful for this process.
You have 15 more seconds.
Donc, j'ai bien retenu qu'on ne peut pas.
So we can't only take into account the protection of women and economic development, but also of the environment, if I understood you correctly.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yes.
We're now going to... Oh, poop. Sorry, 1 second. Got it. Okay. Sometimes I'm out of control. Anyway, we're going to just now pass it over for our next 6 minutes to Leah Kazan. Leah, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. I've heard a number of questions during committee, and, we very often talk about economic prosperity in terms of resource development. I think we often in this discussion, particularly in places like the House of Commons, forget that the prosperity of this country was built upon and continues to be built upon the exploitation of lands, territories, and resources, and the peoples in Indigenous territories, that the reason we suffer from poverty is from development in the absence of lifting up human rights and involvement. Specifically, something you mentioned when we're talking about exploitation, my first question is for Diane Red Sky, who I am privileged to work with in Winnipeg and know very well. You spoke about sexual predators. One of the reasons why this study is so important is the reality that we have many sexual predators that come into our community. that work in these industries without safety checks, criminal record checks. I want you to paint, and as a result of that, you know, we've seen a lot of sexual exploitation of women, girls, and Two-Spirit, from as young as little kids. I heard a report of a young girl, 13 years old, in fact, in BC. Could you please paint a picture about how this sexual exploitation crisis around resource extraction companies impacts the health and wellness of communities? And I know I only have 6 minutes, but I'll start with that and move forward. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, and thank you, Leah. Nice to see you. So the two important things, and again, getting down to, you know, it's really as basic as men with money who are transient, you're going to have forms of sexual exploitation and violence. That is, I have through the National Task Force, as well as my experience working as a organization providing family violence support services, those are pretty consistent, almost guaranteed a dynamic that exists. And the impact to those communities and to the women in those communities is terrible. And so when we look at, and we also have to remember that these industries that promote or allow or don't do anything, silence is just as, you know, same as consent. So that they do nothing about it. They do nothing about the violence that is being perpetuated. And so there really is an important role and responsibility in all of that. And again, I want to draw this committee to the Manitoba Clean Environment Commission report that is really outlining what is happening in Northern Manitoba. And there's lots of opportunity to not only to learn from that report, but also to ensure that our leadership is involved in developing those solutions.
Thank you so much. Call to justice. My next question is for Madame Varley. 3.5 calls for resource development industries, government, and service providers to anticipate and recognize increased demand on social infrastructure because of development projects, and social infrastructure to be expanded to meet the anticipated needs of the host communities. We have numerous examples of what this looks like on the ground. I wanted just briefly, if you can tell me what that would look like, and is there currently adequate funding being provided to communities to make sure that communities can mitigate and put in place a proper safety plan for women, girls, and Two-Spirit?
Thank you. I think the biggest issue in northwestern BC, where there's a pipeline going in, is in anticipation of all the housing needs. All the spare housing got taken up, and all the worst housing, which is the housing that Indigenous single-parent families are in, you know, moldy coal basements, and even those went into impossible rental levels for Indigenous families. So we rendered a lot of Indigenous people homeless, even at the start of any major industrial project, because those folks come in, swoop in, buy up all the housing and stuff because they know they're going to live there for a few years. So that's the biggest issue, is making sure that we're creating that safe housing for people.
Just a question on that, because I'm running out of time. Would you say that the resource extraction is taking up space, is resulting in exacerbating the housing crisis in nations?
Yes.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Anything else? I think we have a couple more seconds, Chair. Is that right?
Oh, sure. I thought I saw things.
33 more seconds.
Yeah, and then again, you know, I'm really troubled by this concept of finding a balance between violence, essentially, and resource development. I really think that we need to have a zero tolerance of violence against Indigenous women and demand that of the resource sector. I think that's an important change that we need to make in our sector. But again, it's housing, it's resources, it's access to food security, it's the childcare becomes a big issue. every single area of a family's expenses and outgoing costs are impacted when resource industries come to town. They don't actually benefit the people who are, the lower end of the financial spectrum. They get bumped out, and their housing situations get awful, and then the family becomes destabilized.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We're now going to go into our second round. So to begin, we'll have 5 minutes with Shelby Nyman. Shelby, you have the floor for 5.
Chair, I'll start by suggesting that safety of women and girls is important, and all possible impacts of resource development, they need to be explored. Leslie, you mentioned zero tolerance, and indeed, I think, of course, that would be a goal. Deb Gray, you raised the question, who plays the role in educating the industry of resource development? And I couldn't agree more, that the government, industry, and communities all need to be proactive. We also heard earlier that there's often a link between that of poverty and violence, and further, that there is a link between resource development and economic reconciliation. So my first question would be for either Leslie, Valerie, or Deb Gray. What current resources do you see that are currently being used to gauge the situation? What kind of enforcement is happening? And are the numbers consistent across the board?
Shelby, who would you like to start first? Just since you've put it out to everybody.
Well, let's ask, we'll start with Deb Gray. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I don't have the statistics. I can't really see what else is going on. I can only see from my little community, which is Watson Lake in the Yukon Territory, and there's no resources. It's a mess. And it's everything that comes is short term. Everything that comes is not adequate. Everything that it comes is not dealing with the base problem, which is the healing of the people. That's my comment.
Leslie?
Same. We don't have the resources to address the increase in violence against Indigenous women and girls, particularly in that, in the Northwest where the pipeline is going through. There have been no additional resources that I'm aware of that have been sent to Indigenous women and girls. As I said, I gave you the example of the resource. They came in there with their safety plan, which they hadn't bothered to consult, I don't think, a single Indigenous woman on, and it was a ridiculous plan. So yeah, there's no resources, and there should be. I agree that there, with Deborah Red Sky, that it's inevitable that there's going to be violence, even though we expect zero tolerance, even though we know that we are the commodity at the end of the day that gets tossed aside. But that said, why isn't the industry going in ahead of time and setting up some really strong resources with community buy-in for Indigenous women and girls? I think that's an important question.
I'll ask another short question just for clarification for Diane Red Sky. Earlier, you had an exchange with my colleague with regards to a program in Quebec. Could you possibly share the name of the actual program or the company itself?
I'll have to look at that again. It was through the National Task Force, and really this industry company was at their own expense bringing families to the camps. So rather than isolating primarily and it's primarily men within these camps, that they were actually bringing and funding for families to come into the camps on a regular basis. And so they were constantly looking at problem solving, so with community. And so I'll go back into my notes and provide that information back to the email I got to set this up, or I can pass it on to Leah Gazan as well to forward to the committee as soon as I find it. But again, we want and hope for we can find companies that are committed to what Leslie was saying, coming in advance and really wanting to do some meaningful problem solving with the communities.
Thank you. And that will be impacted. Okay, perfect. And my last question is how, if at all, do you see Indigenous women and girls intersecting identify factors such as disability, socioeconomic status, and age affect their vulnerabilities to and experiences of violence in the context of resource extraction projects?
Can I just clarify the question? How do we see the intersection?
Yes.
Okay. Well, very quickly, they're very strong. Indigenous women who are with mental health issues or who have been born with disabilities, we often see them in crisis and seeking support services, and they're being exploited generally by older men. Dr. Jennifer Charlesworth, the children's advocate here in British Columbia, is about to start researching and put a report together on that very issue. So stay tuned.
Thank you so much. We're now going to move over for the next 5 minutes to Mark Soray. Mark, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Merci beaucoup aux témoins.
Thank you very much to the witnesses today. Thank you for your recommendations, and thank you for sharing examples with us. Thank you for enlightening us. My first question is for Ms. Craig. And it's for the Yukon Aboriginal Women's Council. You received federal funds, and how were those funds used? Do you have any specific recommendations for how we could change the way funds are distributed so they're distributed to more Indigenous organizations?
Like that for me, please.
Okay, so essentially, my understanding is that you received financial support from the federal government on some of the programming, and I want to see your recommendations on the criteria of the funding and any recommendations that you have to try and look at how to enhance that funding so that it could be utilized in other organizations.
I'm so sorry, I can't address your question. I'm the stand-in for Terry Szabo, who's the president of the Yukon Aboriginal Women's Council. I don't know the answers to your questions.
Okay, so that's okay. The other question, Madame Redsky, you talked about the IBA agreements, and you mentioned the example, my colleague earlier, about Quebec. Wondering, because obviously a lot of these, I part of Sudbury, the mining community, decades talked about IBA agreements, how important they are. But I don't think a lot of the IBA agreements, especially in the past, focused on the social determinants, looking at housing, looking at specific violence against women. So I'm wondering if you have any examples, and do you feel recommendations by the federal government that we should be looking at funding organizations to provide education to resource base like MAC, the mining industry, COSIA on the oil and gas, so they could then educate their members, the private sector members, to make sure that in impact benefit agreements, there are criteria set down. So what role do you think the federal government, because a lot of these are negotiated with local chiefs, which sadly are probably men, with council. So how do you feel the role of the federal government should be to provide that leadership to try and educate the association so they could educate then their members?
First, just to clarify, my last name is Redsky. I would say specifically for the role that the federal government can play, it is, I would prioritize giving the resources to the Indigenous communities and to the Indigenous leadership for those answers, rather than giving the dollars to the industry itself. I think the industry itself can probably afford to invest and should be investing into their own growth and development when it comes to addressing violence against Indigenous women and being proactive when they are entering into communities when they're setting up shop. They need to, just as Leslie was sharing, be nice for them to be able to do that in advance, and do it in a meaningful way. Good.
And Ms. Varley, you mentioned about the lack of stats. What do you think the federal government's role, like Stats Canada, to collect more data to support organizations and services? Because there's a wide range here. Do you have any specific recommendations on the collection of data?
No specific. I'm not a data expert, but what I see and what I know is that if we don't have data, then we don't get the funding to address the problem, because we can't prove that we have a problem without data. And so around it goes. And yet, the data is that Indigenous women don't report violence because it's not safe for them to report it to the police. They might get apprehended, or their children apprehended, or accused of being a sex worker. And so they don't report. But I think that we need possibly an external source to collect data, because it's not safe for us to report data. So yeah, and we do need this information. Stats Canada needs that information.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're now going to switch over to 2.5 minutes, and I'm going to pass the floor over to Adrienne. You have 2.5 minutes.
Bonjour, je remplace André.
I'm replacing my colleague. No problem. My question is the following. Can you help us understand the link between resource extraction and violence against women, Indigenous women and girls?
Who specifically are you asking? We have a variety of witnesses here. Who would you like to put that to, Sylvie?
Oui, ma question va au...
My question is for all the witnesses, please.
Leslie, if you want to get started.
One of the go-to books that I look at is this one. It's called The Beginning and End of Rape by Sarah Deer. And there's lots of Indigenous women academics who have written these kinds of books who talk about the direct connection between colonization and the rape and abuse of women's bodies, and the idea that Indigenous women prior to colonization had far more agency over their bodies than European women settlers who came here. And so the intention was to set Indigenous women in their place, partly by raping them, and also the connection between the rape of Indigenous women in the land, as if it's for the settlers to take. So I really encourage you to have a look at these kinds of books. And here there's a whole lot of explanation here about colonization and settler abuse of land and abuse of Indigenous women's bodies.
I'm just going to pass it over to Ms. Grigg, if you want to respond.
I'm sorry, I can't respond. I don't have any available information to pass along.
Fair enough. Diane, would you like to respond?
Sure. So again, this is rooted in you have resource communities who they're really parachuting in. They're staying for a short period of time or even a long period of time, but there's a designated time. So they're never going to be a part of the community permanently. And so they're all temporary. And so when you have temporary and you then many of these industries are male dominated. So now you're back to that formula. Men with money who are transient, that's directly connected to violence and sexual exploitation.
Oh, thank you very much. We're now going to move on for the next 2.5 minutes to Leah. Leah Gazan, you have 2.5.
Thank you so much, Chair. And I think that's an important point about the hypersexualization of Indigenous women I brought up during a committee talking about even during Halloween costumes like the sexy squaw or the polka hottie, and how we're hypersexualized and makes us more susceptible and vulnerable to violence, which segues into Call for Justice 3.7 for all governments to provide continual and accessible healing programs and support for all children and families of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQ individuals, and develop a permanent fund that is distinctions-based. Madame Vardy, could you please speak to the importance of accessible and culturally relevant healing programs to support communities and families impacted by violence from transient workers involved in resource development projects?
What I see here in BC is that a lot of Indigenous women who've been impacted by violence are, their spirits, their souls, their bodies are traumatized, and we pass down that trauma. If we're not able to heal it, if we're not provided with the resources and the supports to adequately, culturally heal ourselves, and I don't mean accessing mainstream services or making everybody in mainstream service organizations polite so that we can access it. I mean real healing that connects us back to our own culture and our own communities and back to the land and our understanding of spirit and soul. I think this is what is important, and it can't be done by mainstream organizations. It really has to be done within our own Indigenous communities and
Thank
cultures.
you so much. I just wanted to end off with Diane Redsky. I know that you are an icon in Winnipeg for Indigenous-led and driven solutions. Can you speak to the importance of having Indigenous-led, Indigenous-driven solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that is one of the foundational principles within the Urban Subworking Group National Action Plan that I encourage you to read, because it really talks about funding Indigenous-led organizations, because that's where the solutions are. All too often, non-Indigenous organizations receive the funding. And the last thing is that I would add to distinction-based, that it's regardless of residency. So wherever you live, you should have access to funding.
Perfect. We're now going to go into our third round, and we're back to the 6-minute rounds, okay? So we're going to start with Dominique. Dominique, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. I think that all my colleagues in the room and all my Conservative colleagues on this committee support a zero-tolerance approach. My colleagues have said it, and I will say it again. What I think is unfortunate in what I just heard and what I've read is the desensitization of people and stakeholders with this file. Ms. Barley, if I understood correctly, you said that the sector is not the only responsible party, and if I misunderstood, please let me know. I see this as a shared responsibility. A company, the sector, communities, the government, local elected figures, police officers, they all share responsibility. My question is for you, Ms. Barley. And if the other panelists have anything to add, I would be more than happy to hear from you as well. Could you, if you could assemble all of those people today around a table, Ms. Redsky talked about a round table, if you had the opportunity to have all of these people at a table, who would be doing what and when? I think that would be the question to ask. We need to act, and I don't think that the responsibility falls on only one group. How do you see this shared responsibility? And what task would you give to each of those impacted parties? And with regards to what Indigenous women and girls are facing. Ms. Varley, please.
I suppose I would start in that room by reminding everyone that Indigenous women are human beings too, and they're subject to human rights, the same as every other Canadian in this country. And all the laws of violence against women and girls apply. Now, could I ask the police to work with us to make sure that they are complying with those laws and make it safe for Indigenous women to report violence? I would ask the resource sectors to develop a zero tolerance policy for their workers to make sure that if there is any violence, that they are outed and that there doesn't have to be this burden of proof through this justice system where women have to take it and they are, essentially re-victimizing themselves going through a court process. So we get rid of all that. If we've got reports of violence from men working in the sector, then we move them out of that sector and we don't get them back. I would ask the resource sector to do the in-depth reference checks and background checks on the people who are working in the sector so that we're not bringing in dangerous predators into the community to the degree that we know that we are. I would ask the communities, the municipalities, the town councils, the Indigenous communities to collaborate and work together to ask themselves, okay, what can we do? What are we going to do to support and protect women and girls and make sure that women, Indigenous women and girls in particular, are enjoying the same level of human rights protection that every other Canadian gets to enjoy? So what do we need to put in place in our communities to ensure that all of these processes are there? Deborah, maybe you have some more to add to that?
Est-ce que, Deborah, je sais pas si vous...
Deborah, I don't know if you had anything to add, but it seems so simple that all we need is some leadership. We need someone who says we're sitting down all together and we're going to see what the situation is. We're going to look at it with the desire to change things. Is this a possibility with industry?
Well, I would say that if they're not doing it now, they're not doing it at all. And there's no interest of changing that. I think it needs to be forced. I think there needs to be some way in which there is that industry is mandated well in advance to work with communities to identify all of the impacts that their presence is going to have to the entire community in all aspects, and then create that common table to problem solve around all of them.
Est-ce que, je sais pas combien de temps...
I don't know how much time I have left. Do you believe that impact assessments that are done should examine a company and differentiate between, or rather, is it a good idea to look at the history? Is this something that you believe in?
Madame Varley, si...
Ms. Varley.
History of what? History of the Indigenous group, the land, the people, or the history of the company? I'm not sure what your question is.
On parle dans les...
In the National Inquiry, we talk about impact assessments before a project is implemented. That's not exactly how it's worded, but to have impact assessments, not only environmental ones, but perhaps also on the social economic factors of the presence of women, to look at a future project and also have a lens of protecting women and what the impact that can have on men and women and Indigenous women. Is this something that you believe in?
I'll give you about 15 seconds to reply to that.
Absolutely, yes, I do. Of course, protecting Indigenous women and protecting all women and girls is going to benefit all of society. It's not going to harm anybody to add further protection to us. It's going to enhance and improve society.
Okay. Thank you very much. I just want to check as we're doing this. Miss Craig, I just want to double check. Are you getting the interpretation? Do you hear? Is it only English that you're hearing?
Yes.
Okay. So if you look down, not a problem. I think that's the problem. There is a translation button. I believe that it should be at the very, very bottom. Now on mine, it's showing a translation. So English, it will show you the English, French, or the floor. The clerk, Alexi, you may know differently. It's showing on the bottom of mine, on the bottom of my screen. Perhaps it may look different on Miss Griggs. Sorry about that.
Even if I push that button, it doesn't come on.
It's not showing the interpretation or options for the floor?
It is showing interpretation options, but if I push the unmute button, it doesn't unmute.
It should go to give your choice. Okay, clerk, I'm going to talk to you. I think this may be where she's muting one over the other, so I'm going to pass it to you. I think you know more about this.
Yeah, so Ms. Gregg, if you click on the interpretation icon, what are your options?
There's three. There's interpretation, English, French. Yeah.
And if you click on the English one, can you select the English?
Do I just click on it or what?
Yeah, you just click on it.
I did, and nothing happens.
Perhaps
we can try maybe.
I know sometimes there's no, did you check that other about muting other things? Did you do that also, Ms. Grigg? Because I think sometimes that causes problems if you've checked that box.
What box? Sorry.
Okay, then we're good, good. Perhaps, clerk, maybe you could speak in French and see if she's receiving the translation now.
Oui, on peut faire un.
Yes, let's do a test. If you can hear me in English, please nod.
Okay.
So, Ms. Gregg, you're still not getting the interpretation?
No.
Could we have somebody from IT call her and work that through? Is that possible?
Yeah, we can have somebody call her, yeah.
Perhaps with that, then what we'll do is, because I do know that we have votes this evening as well, and I know that there's lots coming up. We have a vote at 5:45, and I don't want to delay too many things. Perhaps what we can do is we can switch over and go to Jenna for her 6 minutes, if that's okay. And Jenna, if you have something specific to Ms. Gregg, then we can ask in the latter part of your 6 minutes. I'll pass the floor over to you, Jenna.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much to the chair and my sincere thanks to the witnesses that have joined us today. I'd say I'm learning a lot today, to be completely candid, and I really appreciate the expertise and the insights that you're sharing with us today. So my thanks. I think I'll start with Ms. Varley. I had read a bit about some of the various prevention programs that you run at the association, the Friendship Centers. And, obviously, what we're hearing today with respect to, demanding zero tolerance for violence against women from the resource sector. I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the prevention programs that you have tried. And I think twofold, the impact or what else you would like to be doing or suggest be done.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, we have developed, we've had many project-based funds to develop some capacity. So we've worked with Indigenous youth, for example, to teach them about their body and their agency over their own bodies and how they get to decide if and when somebody gets to touch them and how. And so we've spent some time doing that, but that was a project-based funding and it's over. We did some work, we've done a lot of research work looking at sex trafficking of Indigenous girls who are sometimes in our housing projects or in our poorer neighborhoods, and they're being targeted by traffickers. And so we've worked with those women and girls to try to teach them to learn to protect their bodies and protect themselves, and how to seek help and resources. We've very generously had a telephone company donate to us 1,000 phones with talk and text, so that if they are Indigenous women and girls are reduced to having to hitchhike to and from their community into a local town or wherever, then they hopefully have some safety. Sometimes that works. Oftentimes there are dead spots. There are still very many dead spots in BC for cellular service. So that's not always applicable. Recently we've started to develop some training and capacity for Indigenous women to provide anti-violence services, support services to Indigenous women and girls. So generally in BC, that is not the case, that you can call, you call a helpline and stuff, and you don't get an Indigenous person on the end of it. So one of the areas that we've been really working on lately is developing our own capacity to provide services by and for Indigenous women and girls.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Obviously, incredibly important work. The next question I'd like to go to, I just wanted to follow up with Miss Red Sky. A previous one of my colleagues had asked you a question with respect to kind of talking about how government, families, and partners, how we can all work together as a community in order to develop community-based solutions to best support Indigenous women and girls. And I think your answer was along the lines of forcing or mandating the resource industry to work with the community proactively. That's a very stark statement, and I'd really love for you to build on that. What does that look like to be really impactful?
Yes, well, and again, and thank you for following up on that. I'd like to begin just saying, like, most of industry, I think, it has been very rare. In fact, in my entire career, I only heard of one in Quebec who actually made an effort to be proactive with their impact to the community, both socially, to the environment, etc. So that tells me a lot. It tells me a lot that why are not others doing it? And, because to me, I think it's a resource problem. It eventually cuts into the bottom line. And because will take investments of resources and of money in order for that to do it well. And so I do think forms of mandating, having the impact assessments, we have to do that to the environment, and I would add a social impact assessment be added to that has full engagement of the communities in the surrounding areas, and then ensure that there are adequate resources to problem solve and invest into those solutions, and that be part of the whole package that is mandated. Miigwech.
20 seconds left.
Okay. Incredible. I think I'll leave it there. Appreciate the fulsome answer and the amazing work that you're all doing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jenna. We're now going to move over to Adrienne. Adrienne, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Sylvie. Sorry.
Thank you. With everything that we heard, it's certain that we have a zero tolerance. And according to the witnesses, what could explain that there is still violence against women and Indigenous women in the context of resource exploitation?
I can go first. I think it's still there because we still allow it to be there. We still allow the resource industry to use Indigenous women and girls without full accountability. And I think that's the only reason why it's still there is because we haven't mandated, we haven't required any changes. it's completely possible, as Deborah has outlined, Deborah Red Sky has outlined how we can make these changes.
Leslie, if I can follow up with what you're saying, one of the things we also need to acknowledge is the leadership and middle management of these companies is predominantly still white men. And so I think that when you think about trying to make any systemic changes within these corporations, actually on the ground level, you don't have individuals working in those areas that can actually bring the intel of the Indigenous experience. And so what we're really trying to do is sort of mesh water and oil together. And so I think that just needs to be acknowledged, that unless there's some promotion of leadership within these corporations, it's very difficult for me to imagine what change would look like there.
If I could carry on, I can tell you that the root of everything is the self. If you've got a culture of people who are aggressive, they're going to be aggressive in all sorts of ways. I would suggest that all the resource developers have psychologists write assessments, and all the people who are going to work there do assessments, because you can screen out misogyny, you can screen out violence, you can screen out all sorts of things through psychological testing, and that could be done, and that would improve things all over the place, because the root of all violence and all aggressive behavior is the self. And if you've got immature, undeveloped personalities coming into these camps, you're going to get all the havoc, and you're going to get all the misogyny, and you're going to get all the violence. If you have well-developed people coming in, they're going to treat each other respectfully. So you need to be looking at who's coming in, and you can see who's coming in if you do psychological testing.
Des changements pour se faire.
What concrete measures need to be implemented, and who needs to implement these measures to counter this issue with violence against women?
Government needs to have the resources available and make the resource developers responsible for assessing who's coming into these camps, into these areas. And also government needs to make resources available to uplift the people so that they are empowered. Because if they are empowered people, they're not going to be victims. It's rooted in everything's rooted in the self. And if you have well-developed self everywhere, you're going to have a harmonious and respectful environment. If you have areas of the population that don't have well-developed selves, that are immature people are violent people, and immature people will treat each other badly. So you need to cultivate the empowerment of the self and make it healthy everywhere.
The only thing I would add to what Diane said is that in addition to sort of looking at the individual as a problem, I think we need to look at it as a systemic issue. In addition to what I said earlier, it is sometimes easier to think about it as that these are just some individuals that are bad, and if we can just pluck them away and put them somewhere else. I think if we're not addressing the systemic issue, so when you think about like who can do what, here in Vancouver, if a developer is going to put a building up, they have to give up a certain amount of amenity space to the community free. And so I think when I hear what Deborah and Leslie are both talking about, this is about mandating. It is about putting in policy at the highest level of our federal government that says that when these corporations do come into communities, they have to put away a chunk of their money into that community. And then I don't want to repeat what Deborah has spoken about with regards to having this being co-development of resources. So I won't repeat that.
Well, and just to clarify, my name's Diane, everyone. I just want to say two quick things, that let's not forget that there is really harmful stereotypes about who Indigenous women are, and we are often targeted. So it's, not because we have low self-esteem, it is because we are targeted by people who intend on hurting us. The second thing, that the answers are going to be at the community level. So making significant investments into Indigenous-led organizations and Indigenous communities, that is vital in this whole response, because that's where the answers are.
Which? 10 seconds.
I agree. I want to say Indigenous women have long been targeted, and that's been made acceptable in Canadian society as a whole. And so government has some responsibility in addressing this and ensuring that Canadians understand that we are also human beings and we should have the same rights as every other Canadian.
Thank you so much. We're now going to move back to Leah Gazan. Leah?
Thank you so much. And I think the discussion about the dehumanization of Indigenous women is really critical here. And I think a lot of people still don't realize that Indigenous women in real time today, under the Indian Act, never mind not having the same rights as men, still don't have the same rights as other women. And why this study is so important, why I'm so grateful to the committee for being open to these really difficult discussions. My question is for Madame King or Vardy. You spoke a little bit about safe transportation. I was horrified when Greyhound bus services were cut. And you're part of the MMIWG coalition that your organization was part of, identified the critical need for safe, affordable, and reliable transportation, and that its absence would lead to an increased hitchhiking, which is directly correlated to the ongoing crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across the country. I can only think of the Highway of Tears in BC, where you're from, and the tragic stories and unsolved stories that we've heard. Could you please share how safe, affordable, and reliable transportation would make a difference in keeping Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQ plus individuals safe in rural and remote areas that resource development projects frequently take place?
I'm happy to speak to that. I grew up in northern BC, and even as a young girl myself, going to elementary school and starting high school, if I was walking in my little town that I was being cruised by older men trying to pick me up. Visibly Indigenous women are always targeted in this way. That hasn't changed in those small northern towns. And now one of the best places to look for Indigenous women is along the highways where they're trying to hitchhike to go visit a friend or go to a doctor's appointment, whatever, for whatever reason. So yeah, these transportation, not just the the Greyhound bus closing down, but also, we have some other sectors who are providing services, but you can only get on the health bus if you have a health issue and you have to have a prescription, or you can only get a ride into town if you're from one of the First Nations communities, if you can prove that you're going to see your doctor. I mean, it's ridiculous how that bus drives empty up and down the highways all day and through our communities because people don't have the right documentation to get on a ride. So it could be better coordinated and better organized for our people. Friendship centers are trying to provide little routes between centers. We have all, got a few buses and cars up there, and we're trying to provide cell phones to provide safety to women who indeed actually have to hitchhike. So it isn't safe, and we need to create some more safety. We enjoy this kind of safety in the city. I can hop on a bus anytime and go just about anywhere I want within the 50-mile radius, but up in the north, that's absolutely not possible.
So would you say that providing transportation would actually save lives? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I wanted to move on to Madame Redsky, Diane Redsky, and part of the study and certainly related to our notes had to do with Manitoba Hydro and the impact of Manitoba Hydro and resource development on Indigenous women and girls in northern Manitoba. I know you spoke to that. Can you talk very briefly about MKO, some of the research and findings and recommendations that they've come up with to improve safety for women and girls and Two-Spirit living in northern Manitoba?
Sure. Okay. Yes, I can. But very briefly, because this is a really important voice that is MKO's voice, that because they have been really leading this issue ever since the Manitoba Clean Environment Commission released a report in 2018, which is critically important. And I am aware and certainly would stand beside MKO on their call for a public inquiry to really address the all of the implications that have come out of documenting the horrific reality of Indigenous women and girls as it relates to many resource development, and then specifically that Manitoba Hydro report. And that is critically important moving forward to support them to really do a deep dive and understand just similarly to what you're doing here, because we really have to get at the root of what are the challenges, and most importantly, how can we prevent this, and how can we support those relationships that exist that are really important to exist in our society with industry and government and our communities, working hand in hand to ensure that they are all working towards public safety, and in particular, the safety of Indigenous women and girls in all aspects of what they do.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're now going to go back to our rounds of 5 minutes and 2.5 minutes, and I'm going to start that off with Shelby. Shelby, you've got 5 minutes.
Do you have to tell her? Shelby has passed her time on to me, so it's going to be Michelle.
Well, then,
is that okay, Chair?
Okay, Michelle. I will perhaps we'll let that go today. So go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Chair. This has been full of solutions for me as I listen and we go around the table and I listen to each of you. Miss Red Sky, Diane, I'm wondering, is there any stats on men with money who are transient?
That would pretty much align with what the industry sector is. That would
Fair
be my
enough.
answer.
I want to go back to Deborah, because Deborah, we were talking and I align greatly with what you're saying about self-regulation, and it's sort of a key to breaking a lot of systemic trauma and patterns that we do as people. So I'm very interested in that as well. I'm curious to know what you think those solutions are. When I asked you about truth and reconciliation, I'm going to go back to another recommendation, and I have a feeling you're going to say the same thing. We call upon the federal government, this is under education, number 7, we call upon the federal government to develop with Aboriginal groups a joint strategy to eliminate educational and employment gaps between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. Do you feel the federal government is doing this? Is my first question.
No. They might be trying, but they're not very good at it. It's a huge problem because it's a programming system, and that program doesn't match the Indigenous program. The Indigenous natural program is self-sustaining and vibrant and balanced and harmonious and equilateral, and the government system preaches something else and indoctrinates people with something else. So they're indoctrinating a conflict of consciousness. And that's very wrong, as far as I'm concerned. It's another sign of colonialism. The entire education system needs to be sensitized, and it needs to take lessons from the lifestyle and the spirituality and the mindset of the Indigenous people. And they don't do that. They poo-poo it and they minimize it because they're dominant.
I agree with you. And that comes back to the recommendations from Diane about the holistic. And I'm going to go back to what I witnessed this past week. It's very timely for me being in Alberta and sitting at a Chamber of Commerce meeting where we were talking about employment and the tourism sector and the pipelines. And we had this beautiful, amazing chief. And it was the first time she'd been invited to the table. And an amazing thing happened because the city didn't realize that they were being, their housing issues were being extremely stressed because of the workers on the pipeline. And a lot of the Indigenous from the First Nation were working on it. And she said, well, we're injecting money into your economy. But until they sat at the table and they didn't know the stress that had been created, but both wanted to reap the benefits of the resource development and the economic reconciliation. They were both happy with that. And I think if I was to ask, would everybody agree on this panel that we do need resource development and we do need economic reconciliation? But there's a big but after it. But if I could, can we agree that we all need the resource development to inject money into our economy? Can I just get a yes if you agree or a no?
I'd recommend going one at a time so you can get it on the record via Zoom.
Yes.
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 Yes. Okay. Deborah?
Yes.
Okay. And Leslie?
Yes, I already said yes.
Okay, sorry, I didn't hear you. Okay, sorry. So I think now the but comes into play of implementing how it can all work to benefit better. And I'm just going to ask if some of these things would work. One of the big issues, and I want to point out what my colleague on the NDP said. I think it is important to recognize that we wouldn't be in this position had it not been for colonialization. And I actually want to take the moment to recognize that we're here because of that. So, but we're here now, so what are we going to do now? So I want to just be on the record for recognizing that. But for Indigenous, by Indigenous is very much a conservative mandate. And when I saw this Chamber of Commerce table, and when all of a sudden, by the end of it, they had really come up with amazing solutions. And I'm a big believer in incentivization. What about, having incentivizing?
Michelle?
Yeah. Oh, shoot. I ran out of time.
Sorry. You did run out of time. I'm
Shoot.
sorry about that.
I was just going to tell you the best part.
I know it was going to be awesome, but
Okay.
we will come back. We'll see what our time looks like. We're going to now go to Anita for 5 minutes. Anita?
Yes, thank you very much. And I really want to thank our witnesses today for what have been very enlightening and also some very powerful recommendations that you've provided us. I'd like to delve a little bit into what I'm sort of in my mind starting to hear, which is really about impunity. And it goes back to some of the things that you've said. I know that Ms. Varley, you used a term that was really quite alarming. It's accepted collateral damage, that Indigenous women and girls are accepted collateral damage. Ms. Red Sky, what you described about the stereotypes and this assumption that Indigenous women will do anything for money, or the cruising that Ms. Varley referred to. And then Ms. Grieg, this notion of, and it's interesting you use the word apathy, that there's a disempowerment, that Indigenous women are in a state of apathy. And these are things that it is really hard as legislators to try to develop programming or funding models that can actually address those kinds of very, very deeply entrenched historic, colonial, societal notions that in many cases are probably even unconscious. And they're perpetuated, they're internalized, but they're also perpetuated when women are treated as objects and objectified. And I wonder, because I know that there's a lot of money in the budget. Last budget, something like $860 million for safety in Indigenous communities. We've got money in this budget, 500 and some million for gender-based violence. And yet what I'm hearing from you is that resources aren't there, or when resources are there, they are not being co-managed and developed with the input of the women who are impacted. Can you give us advice? What is it that we can do, particularly as a committee making recommendations? What is it that we can do that will allow us as legislators and the government to provide the resources that could then be used to address this overwhelming impunity with which the transient men and others that you're talking about are getting away with these things? I'll start. I'd like each of you to answer, but I'll start with Ms. Red Sky.
Okay, so first, the solutions around everything that was done throughout the national inquiry, looking at the pathways as well as the principles of change, you really need to read that and look through that lens, because that is it is a holistic, interconnected approach that will change things, no doubt. And so that is critically important, as well as ensuring that, and that could be a policy decision by this government, that if you're funding Indigenous-led initiatives, then fund the Indigenous-led organizations that go with those Indigenous-led initiatives. All too often, it is non-Indigenous organizations receiving the funding to help us, and then that only goes halfway. And so the solutions have always been there, and we just need the opportunity to be supported to help realize those initiatives.
Thank you. Thank you. And I heard your earlier comment about long-term funding as well. Ms. Varley, go ahead. The question on impunity.
I agree with what Diane has said, and I would just emphasize providing resources to Indigenous women and girls, and letting us decide how we're going to use that funding to safeguard ourselves and support ourselves and provide the right services for us. And that's going to look different from province to province and community to community. So it's really important that the whole one-size-fits-all approach to violence against women nationwide isn't going to be effective for us. We need to work within our own cultures and our own communities to understand what it's going to look like for us and how we're going to support ourselves.
Okay, thank you. I'm thinking also on the impunity side as well. What we do to make sure that people are held accountable. I don't know, Ms. Grieg, if you wanted to weigh in on this issue.
I agree with what the two previous witnesses have said totally. And as far as impunity, the resource developers have to have commitment to be invested in the communities. The resource developers have to be held accountable for the fallout of the resource development wherever they go, constantly. And it has to be regulated, and it has to be implemented, and it has to be, there's sanctions have to be done.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm just going to let you know the bells are now ringing. We are almost through the fourth round. We just have to, if we wish to finish it off, but I would need the consent from the committee to continue with our fourth round so that we can do that. The fourth round right now is scheduled to be 15 more minutes. There is, 15 more. No, golly gee, 15 more minutes. And I would need approval from everybody to continue with that. I just want to make sure everybody in the room is okay, because I know is everybody, maybe the clerk can tell me if there's any nays in the room. Seeing no nays, we're going to continue with this round of questioning. So I'm now going to pass the floor over. We're going to be going to Adrienne, then Leah, then Michelle, and then there's one more round for the Liberals for 5 minutes. So Sylvie, we're going to get it right this time. Sylvie, you have 2.5 minutes. Go ahead.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The witnesses spoke about industries exploiting resources in their regions. Do they have to put internal and external measures in place? Are there things that should be done so that they have to put measures in place? My question is for all the witnesses, please.
I can begin. Yes, I think we need to put measures in place anytime that we're going into any resource development or extraction. Somebody mentioned incentivizing. We can incentivize these industries, by making them put, 10% up front, and they get it back if they clean up the environment and don't abuse any Indigenous women and girls. That would be a great incentive, I think, and we would see some immediate change in behavior.
I agree with that statement totally.
Aux ressources d'aide et de soutien pour les femmes. Excusez, Madame la Présidente.
Apologies, Madam Chair. Can I continue?
left.
Oui, je voulais.
Okay. So there was the matter of access to support for women who are victims of violence, and a lot of Indigenous communities are rural or are far away. What are the specific needs of those communities, in your view?
I believe Leslie spoke to some of these earlier. Leslie, you spoke to housing, you spoke to transportation. I don't know whether you want to speak to some of the rural pieces in addition to that.
For sure, in our rural northeastern communities, we really find it hard to hire professionals. Anybody who's got like a social work or a psychology designation, and are those really effective? For working with Indigenous families, and so that's something that we're trying to do is develop that capacity. But we don't have a whole lot. We don't have a history of capacity and sustained funding in order for us to develop this expertise over time. It's something that we definitely need to start working on.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move it over to Leah. Leah, you have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to correct the record, there was zero additional funding provided in this budget for MMIWG-2S. Just a question to all the panelists. I'll say your name just quickly because I have a follow-up question. Would you say it's a false choice to force Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit to have to choose between economic reconciliation and safety from violence and exploitation? Yes or no, Madame Red Sky?
Sorry, I want to make sure I understand the question.
False choice. Like it's not really a choice to say you either choose your safety or economic reconciliation.
Right.
Is that yes or no? Yes.
Yes.
Madame Varley?
Yes.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Madame King?
Yes.
Madame Gregg?
Yes.
Okay. Just moving forward to Madame King, based on your organization, More Than Bystander Initiative for Resource Industry Workplaces, could you please expand how programs engaging industry workers, could you please expand how programs engaging industry workers, working with industry workers to stand against violence? Sorry, I'm in such a rush, I can't even put my sentence together.
That's okay. Thank you. Thank you for the question, and I'll try to speak fast as well. So when we think about engaging men through the Be More Than a Bystander, we're really targeting leaders. And what we're really doing is asking them, challenging them on having policies in place that is going to hold their employees to account, and having procedures in place to be able to properly investigate when complaints come forward. But furthermore, we've taken it beyond looking at it just from a gender lens and looking at it as a violence against women. We do see the intersections with the discrimination and the racism that also happens for Indigenous workers as well as other marginalized group workers. So the Be More Than a Bystander, it's a simple sort of a program that is to stand up. But when we speak to leaders, what we really look at is that, is there a will in that leadership to create a change? And if there isn't a will, if we don't see that leadership is ready, or they're just bringing us in because there's some incidences that have happened and that they want to do this as a PR exercise, we do not go in and work with those corporations.
Thanks very much. We're now, I'm looking at the time. I'm going to reduce your time down to 4 minutes. So I'm going to start off with Michelle, and then Sonia, if you could direct me who is going to take the last 4 minutes. Michelle, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I do want to say on the record, and I meant to say this last time and I never got to it, as we were sharing information and books for everyone. If I go missing, I'm curious if all 4 witnesses have read that book and would recommend it. And I can see it as maybe being an educational piece, age appropriate for when I look at Diane, you work with youth development as well as Deborah too, as well as Leslie. Just if I could, Leslie, are you familiar with this book, If I Go Missing?
Familiar with it. I haven't read it.
Ninu?
I have not read it.
Yeah. Diane?
I'm not familiar with the book, but I'm certainly familiar with the phrase.
Yeah.
Many Indigenous women reflect on that, including myself.
And Deborah?
I also have not read the book, but I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, I would love everyone in this committee and witnesses today to do that. In terms of solutions for this, I'd love to get to the crux of this. One of the things that came up was transportation, and then having standards for these companies. Diane, would you be open to incentivizing these companies to reinvest into the community, say into transportation?
I think it should be part of their corporate social responsibility to make those investments, given that they profit off whatever industry that they're doing, and it should be something I would have liked to see them do it on their own. But in lieu of that, we need to figure out how to help them get there. So I don't think incentivizing is 100% way to go because they'd be motivated for the wrong reasons. And I'd like to think that they could be motivated for the right reasons because they really genuinely care about the safety and protection of Indigenous women and girls.
Okay. And back to my point about for Indigenous, by Indigenous, Deborah, bringing in the Indigenous women in particular and offering them a seat at the table when resource development is happening in a community and perhaps having jobs or something available to them. Do you think that would work?
Yes, it's a step. It's a step in the right direction. Yes.
Expand on what building relationships would look like if you were in charge between the resource development and the Indigenous communities, in particular women?
I think all the Indigenous communities, if they have women's groups, those women's groups should be informed that this is going to take place, and they should then be able to speak to who should be sitting at that table. I think that in the rural communities especially, there are Indigenous organizations, and many of them are for women, and all of those women's groups should be deciding amongst themselves as to who should sit at the table.
Thank you very much. And I think there was one more question I had. Oh, yes. Overall, is there a recommendation that you would like? I know you had said, Diane, that there was not specific stats, that it was just basically the corporations that were coming through. But do you think it would be valuable to invest from the government on stats of men who are transient, who abuse Indigenous women?
We have about -5 seconds to answer this. So if we could get yeses and nos, that would be great.
No.
I don't think there's a value in putting money to that kind of, we know. We already have that data.
No,
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm now going to turn the last 4 minutes over to Sonia. Sonia Sidhu, you have the floor for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, all the witnesses. The work you are doing in the community. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. My question is that you have spoken about the lack of services in remote communities, including virtual services, as many people needing services do not have access to computer. So what recommendation do you have how government can facilitate connecting residents in the community, and which programs you're recommending and what kind of services? Ms. Gregg and Ms. Red Sky, you can follow on that too.
Thank you. Yes, the rural communities are very hard up as far as technology, and oftentimes the internet systems don't work anyway. So it's really hard, and I think the government needs to invest in getting credentialed professionals made available that can come to these communities and provide services to the communities. The people, the support staff in the communities should also be trained so that they can be made available to support people who are looking for development in all the areas that we're addressing here. And the government needs to make those funds permanent, not just project funds.
And to Madam
Yes. Yeah, and all of that. And I would say what is really important is around the equitable funding. And that is time and time again. And again, Winnipeg is in the south. So, you know, my knowledge is limited. However, our northern friends, you know, constantly share about that inequality of funding. So, you know, what costs in, you know, to run a program in Winnipeg is not the same cost of what it costs in northern Manitoba or anywhere in the north. And so we really need to ensure that there is an equality lens placed to funding and to the resources that are going into the north. And I think we just got used to not doing that, and we need to really shift to look at equitable funding models so that people have enough resources to do the work.
Thank you. And mental health is also a very important issue. And it often remote and virtual tools are utilized to some individual if we're providing that. How can we provide quality mental health services to in remote and northern areas? Do you have a specific programs?
I think around everywhere you go across the country, everybody will have their own strengths and solutions on what works within their community. And so my go-to is always look for the women in the community. And you start there and, you know, expand from that point, because they're the ones that are going to know what's going on and what the solutions are, and really need to be supported to facilitate those solutions.
And Ms. Gregg, you want to add on that?
Indigenous Services Canada does fund mental health services all across the north. And in the Yukon, there's also non-insured health benefits. There's a process to get involved. It's a bit tedious, but it does provide resources. And there are servers for remote areas, which is very important. And all of that is a valuable resource. It's not enough, but it's a valuable resource to get things moving in the right direction, because everybody, especially in the rural communities, needs to hear that they are being supported somehow. And the treatment programs need to be further funded so that the people can get the addictions treatments that they need.
The reason I'm asking that there are federal programs, and sorry.
No, just you can do a 10-second wrap-up.
The reason I'm asking that there's a federal programs and tools like Wellness Together, that we know we have to first listen to the grassroots solution. So in your opinion, is the virtual care model can be utilized in remote and northern areas?
Sonia, I love the question, but we already passed time a little bit more. So I will leave that for everybody to think. So if there is an answer to that, please write into our clerk and talk about that. But thank you so much. And thanks for everybody staying on. I hope that this new format has worked well for everybody. On behalf of the Status of Women Committee, I'd really like to thank our witnesses for today. We will adjourn and see you all back on Friday afternoon. So thank you once again, and we are adjourned for today. Thank you.
you.